Part 4 of a series of unfortunate events, The Vile Village, Book 7, with chapters 8 and 9. Here's chapter 8. Chapter 8. The next morning began with a colorful and lengthy sunrise, which Sunny saw from her hiding place at the bottom of Nevermore Tree. It continued with sounds of awakening crows, which Claus heard from the library in the barn, and followed with the sight of the birds making their familiar circle in the sky, which Violet saw just as she was leaving the inventing studio. By the time Claus joined her sister outside the barn, and Sunny crawled across the flat landscape to reach them, the birds had stopped circling and were flying together uptown, and the morning was so pretty and peaceful that as I describe it, I can almost forget that it was a very, very sad morning for me. A morning that I wish I could strike forever from the Snicket calendar. But I can't erase this day any more than I can write a happy ending to this book, for the simple reason that the story does not go that way. No matter how lovely the morning was, or how confident the Baudelaires felt about what they had discovered over the course of the night, there isn't a happy ending on the horizon of this story, any more than there was an elephant on the horizon of VFD. "Good morning," Violet said to Claus and yawned. "Good morning," Claus replied. He was holding 2 books in his arms, but nevertheless, he managed to wave at Sunny, who was still crawling toward them. "How did everything go with Hector in the inventing studio?" "Well, Hector fell asleep a few hours ago," Violet said, "but I discovered a few small flaws in the self-sustaining hot air mobile home. The engine conductivity was low, due to some problems with the electromagnetic generator Hector built. This meant that the inflation rate of the balloons was often uneven, so I reconfigured some key conduits. Also, the water circulation system was run on ill-fitting pipes, which meant that the self-sustaining aspect of the food center probably wouldn't last as long as it should, so I rerouted some of the aqua cycling." "Ning," Sunny called as she reached her siblings. "Good morning, Sunny," Claus said. "Violet was just telling me that she noticed a few things wrong with Hector's invention, but she thinks she fixed them." "Well, I'd like to test the whole device out before we go up in it, if there's time," Violet said, picking up Sunny and holding her. "But I think everything should work pretty well. It's a fantastic invention. A small group of people could really spend the rest of their lives safely in the air. Did you discover anything in the library?" "Well, first I discovered that books about VFD rules are actually quite fascinating," Claus said. "Rule number 19, for instance, clearly states that the only pens that are acceptable within the city limits are the ones made from feathers of crows. And yet rule number 39 clearly states that it is illegal to make anything out of crow feathers. How can the townspeople obey both rules at once?" "Maybe they don't have any pens at all," Violet said. "But that's not important. Did you discover anything helpful in the rule books?" "Yes," Claus said, and opened one of the books he was carrying. "Listen to this. Rule number 2493 clearly states that any person who is going to be burned at the stake has the opportunity to make a speech right before the fire is lit. We can go to the uptown jail this morning and make sure Jacques gets the opportunity. In his speech, he can tell people who he really is and why he has that tattoo." "But he tried to do that yesterday at the meeting," Violet said. "Nobody believed him. Nobody even listened to him." "I was thinking the same thing," Claus said, opening the second book, "until I read this." "Cowhee?" Sunny asked. "Which meant, is there a rule that clearly states that people must listen to speeches?" "No," Claus replied. "This isn't a rule book. This is a book about psychology, the study of the mind. It was removed from the library because there's a chapter about the Cherokee tribe of North America. They make all sorts of things out of feathers, which breaks rule number 39. "That's ridiculous," Violet said. "I agree," Claus said. "But I'm glad this book was here instead of in town, because it gave me an idea. There's a chapter here about mob psychology." "Was they?" Sunny asked. "A mob is a crowd of people," Claus explained, "usually an angry one. Like the townspeople in the Council of Elders yesterday," Violet said, "in Town Hall. They were incredibly angry." "Exactly," Claus said. "Now listen to this." The middle Baudelaire opened the second book and began to read out loud. "The subliminal emotion tenor of a mob's unruliness lies in solitary opinions, expressed emphatically at various points in the stereo field." "Tenor? Stereo?" Violet asked. "It sounds like you're talking about opera." The book uses a lot of complicated words, Claus said, but luckily there was a dictionary in Hector's library. It has been removed from VFD because it defined the phrase mechanical device. All that sentence means is that if a few people, scattered throughout the crowd, begin to shout their opinions, soon the whole mob will agree with them. It happened in the council meeting yesterday. A few people said angry things, and soon the whole room was angry. Voo, Sunny said, which meant, yes, I remember. When we get to the jail, Claus said, we'll make sure that Jacques is allowed to give his speech. Then, as he explains himself, we'll scatter ourselves throughout the crowd and shout things like, I believe him, and hear, hear. Mob psychology should make everyone demand Jacques' freedom. Do you really think that will work? Violet asked. Well, I'd prefer to test it first, Claus said. Just like you'd prefer to test the self-sustaining hot air mobile home. But we don't have time. Now, Sunny, what did you discover from spending the night under a tree? Sunny held up one of her small hands to show them another scrap of paper. Couplet, she cried out triumphantly, and her siblings gathered around to read it. The first thing you read contains the clue, an initial way to speak to you. Good work, Sunny, Violet said. This is definitely another poem by Isadora Quagmire, and it seems to lead us back to the first poem. It says the first thing you read contains a clue. But what does an initial way to speak to you mean? Violet asked. Initials like VFD? Maybe, Claus replied, but the word initial can also mean first. I think Isadora means that this is the first way she can speak to us, through these poems. But we already know that, Violet said. The Quagmires wouldn't have to tell us. Let's all look at the poems together. Maybe it will give us a complete picture. Violet took the other two poems out of her pocket, and the three children looked at them together. For sapphires we are held in here, only you can under fear. Until dawn comes we cannot speak, no words can come from this sad beak. The first thing you read contains the clue, an initial way to speak to you. The part about the beak is still the most confusing. Claus said. Leocrius, Sunny said, which meant, I think I can explain that. The crows are delivering the couplets. How can that be possible? Violet asked. Lloydia, Sunny answered. She meant, I'm absolutely sure that nobody approached the tree all night, and at dawn the note dropped down from the branches of the tree. I've heard of carrier pigeons, Claus said, those birds that carry messages for a living, but I've never heard of carrier crows. Maybe they don't know that they're carrier crows, Violet said. The Quagmires could be attaching the scraps of paper to the crows in some way, putting them in their beaks or in their feathers, and then the poems come loose when they sleep in Nevermore Tree. The triplets must be somewhere in town, but where? Go, Sunny cried, pointing to the poems. Sunny's right, Claus said excitedly. It says, until dawn comes, we cannot speak. That means they're attaching the poems in the morning, when the crows roost uptown. Well, that's one more reason to get uptown, Violet replied. We can save Jacques? I've been saying his name wrong this whole time. Jacques? Before he's burned at the stake, and search for the Quagmires. Without you, Sunny, we wouldn't know where to look for the Quagmires. Hasserin, Sunny said, which meant, and without you, Claus, we wouldn't know how to save Jacques. And without you, Violet, Claus said, we'd have no chance of escaping from this town. And if we kept standing here, Violet said, we won't save anybody. Let's go wake up Hector and get moving. The Council of Elders said they'd burn Jacques at the stake right after breakfast. Yikes, Sunny said, which meant that doesn't give us much time. So the Baudelaires didn't take much time walking into the barn and through Hector's library, which was so massive that the two Baudelaire sisters could not believe that Claus had managed to find helpful information among the shelves and shelves of books. There were bookshelves so tall that you had to stand on a ladder to reach their highest shelves, and one so short that you had to crawl on the floor to read their titles. There were books that looked too heavy to move, and books that looked too light to stay in one place, and there were books that looked so dull that the sisters could not imagine anyone reading them. But these were the books that were still stacked in huge heaps, spread out on the tables after Claus's all-night reading session. Violet and Sunny wanted to pause for a moment and take it all in, but they knew that they didn't have much time. Behind the last bookshelf of the library was Hector's inventing studio, where Claus and Sunny got their first glimpse of the self-sustaining hot air mobile home, which was a marvelous contraption. 12 enormous baskets, each about the size of a small room, were stacked up in the corner, connected by all sorts of different tubes, pipes, and wires, and circled around the basket were a series of large metal tanks, wooden grates, glass jugs, paper bags, plastic containers, and rolls of twine, along with a number of large mechanical devices with buttons, switches, and gears, and a big pile of deflated balloons. The self-sustaining hot air mobile home, was so immense and complicated that it reminded the two younger Baudelaires of what they thought of when they pictured Violet's inventive brain, and every piece of it looked so interesting that Claus and Sunny could scarcely decide what to look at first. But the Baudelaires knew that they didn't have much time, so rather than explain the invention to her siblings, Violet walked quickly over to one of the baskets, which Claus and Sunny were surprised to see contained a bed, which in turn contained a sleeping Hector. "Good morning," the handyman said, when Violet gently shook him awake. "It is a good morning," she replied. "We've discovered some marvelous things. We'll explain them on our way uptown." "Uptown?" Hector said, stepping out of the basket. "But the crows are roosting uptown. We do the downtown chores in the morning, remember?" "We're not doing any chores this morning," Claus said firmly. That's one of the things we need to explain." Hector yawned, stretched, and rubbed his eyes, and then smiled at the three children. "Well, fire away," he said, using a phrase which here means, "Begin telling me about your plans." The siblings led Hector back through his inventing studio and secret library and waited while he locked up the barn. Then, as they took their first steps across the flat landscape toward the uptown district, the Baudelaire orphans fired away. Violet told Hector about the improvements she had made on his invention, and Claus told him about what he had learned in Hector's library, and Sunny told him, with some translation from her siblings, about her discovery of how Isidore's poems were being delivered. By the time the Baudelaires were unrolling the last scrap of paper and showing Hector the third couplet, they had already reached the crow-covered outskirts of VFD's uptown district. "So the Quagmires are somewhere in the uptown district," Hector said. "But where?" "I don't know," Violet admitted. "But we'd better try to save Jacques first." "Which way is the uptown jail?" Violet asked Hector. "It's across from Foul Fountain," the handyman replied. "But it looks like we won't need directions. Look what's ahead of us." The children looked, and could see some of the townspeople holding flaming torches and walking about a block ahead of them. "It must be after breakfast," Claus said. "Let's hurry." The Baudelaires walked as quickly as they could between the muttering crows roosting on the ground, with Hector trailing skittishly behind them, and soon they rounded a corner and reached Foul Fountain, or at least what they could see of it. The fountain was swarming with crows who were fluttering their wings in the water in order to give themselves a morning bath, and the Baudelaires could scarcely see one metal feather of the hideous landmark. Across the courtyard was a building with bars on the windows and crows on the bars, and the torch-carrying citizens were standing in a half-circle around the door of the building. More VFD citizens were arriving from every direction, and the three children could see a few crow-hatted members of the Council of Elders standing together and listening to something Mrs. Morrow was saying. "It seems we have arrived in the nick of time," Violet said. "We'd better scatter ourselves throughout the crowd. Sunny, you move to the far left. I'll take the far right. "Roger," Sunny said, and began crawling her way through the half-circle of people. "I think I'll just stay here," Hector said quietly, looking down at the ground. But the children had no time to argue with him. Claus began to walk straight down the middle of the crowd. "Wait," Claus called, moving with difficulty through the people. "Rule number 2493 clearly states that any person who is going to be burned at the stake has the opportunity to make a speech right before the fire is lit." "Yes," Violet cried from the right-hand side of the crowd. "Let Jacques be heard." Officer Luciana stepped right in front of Violet, who almost bumped her head on the chief's shiny helmet. Beneath the visor of the helmet, Violet could see Luciana's lipstick mouth rise in a very small smile. "It's too late for that," she said, and a few townspeople around her murmured in agreement. With a clunk of one boot, she stepped aside and let Violet see what had happened. From the left-hand side of the crowd, Sunny crawled over to the shoes of the person standing closest to the jail, and Claus peered over Mr. Lesko's shoulder to get a good look at what everyone was staring at. Jacques was lying on the ground with his eyes closed, and two of the members of the Council of Elders were pulling a white sheet over him as they were tucking him in for a nap. But as dearly as I wish I could write that this is so, he was not sleeping. The Baudelaires had reached the uptown jail before the citizens of VFD could burn him at the stake, but they still had not arrived in the nick of time. Chapter 9. Here's the picture. Chapter 9. There are not many people in the world who enjoy delivering bad news, but I'm sorry to say that Miss Morrow was one of them. When she caught the sight of the Baudelaire orphans gathered around Jacques, she rushed across the courtyard to tell them the details. Wait until the Daily Punctilio hears about this, she said enthusiastically, and pointed at Jacques with the sleeve of her pink robe. Before he could be burned at the stake, Count Omar was murdered mysteriously in his jail cell. Count Olaf, corrected Violet automatically. So you're finally admitting that you know who he is, she cried triumphantly. We don't know who he is, Claus insisted, picking up his baby sister, who was quietly beginning to cry. We only know that he is an innocent man. Officer Luciana clunked forward, and the crowd of townspeople and elders parted to let her walk right up to the children. I don't think that this is a matter for children to discuss, she said, and raised her white-gloved hand in the air to get the crowd's attention. Citizens of VFD, she said grandly, I locked Count Olaf in the uptown jail last night. When I arrived here in the morning, he had been killed. I have the only key to the jail, so his death is quite a mystery. A mystery, Miss Morrow said excitedly, as the townspeople murmured behind her. What a thrill to be hearing about a mystery. Shart, Sonny said tearfully. She meant, a dead man is not a thrill, but only her siblings were listening to her. You will all be happy to know that the famous detective Dupin has agreed to investigate this murder. Officer Luciana continued. He is inside the uptown jail right now, examining the scene of the crime. The famous detective Dupin, Mr. Lesko said. Just imagine. I've never heard of him, said a nearby elder. Me neither, Mr. Lesko admitted, but I'm sure he's very famous. What happened? Violet asked, trying not to look at the white sheet on the ground. How was Jacques killed? Why was anybody guarding him? How could someone have gotten into his cell if you locked it? Luciana turned around and faced Violet, who could see her own astonished reflection in the policewoman's shiny helmet. As I said before, Luciana said again, I don't think this is a matter for children to discuss. Perhaps that man in overalls should take you children to a playground instead of a murder scene. Or downtown to do the morning chores, another elder said, his crow hat nodding. Hector, take the orphans away. Not so fast, called a voice from the doorway of the uptown jail. It was a voice, I'm sorry to say, that the Baudelaire orphans recognized in an instant. The voice was wheezy and scratchy, and it had a sinister smile to it, as if the person talking were telling a joke. But it was not a voice that made the children want to laugh at a punchline. It was a voice that the children recognized from all of the places they had traveled since their parents had died, and a voice the children knew from all of their most displeasing nightmares. It was the voice of Count Olaf. The children's hearts sank, and they turned to see Olaf standing in the doorway of the jail, wearing another one of his absurd disguises. He was wearing a turquoise blazer that was so brightly colored that it made the Baudelaires squint, and a pair of silver pants decorated with tiny mirrors that glinted in the morning sun. A pair of enormous sunglasses covered the entire upper half of his face, hiding his one eyebrow and his shiny, shiny eyes. On his feet were a pair of bright green plastic shoes with yellow plastic lightning bolts sticking out of them, covering his ankle and hiding his tattoo. But most unpleasant of all was the fact that Olaf was wearing no shirt, only a thick gold chain with a detective's badge in the center of it. The Baudelaires could see his pale and hairy chest peeking out of them, and it added an extra layer of unpleasantness to their fear. It's just not cool, Count Olaf said, snapping his fingers to emphasize the word cool, to dismiss suspects from the scene of the crime until Detective Dupin gives the okay. But surely the orphans aren't suspects, one of the elders said. They're only children, after all. It's just not cool, Count Olaf said, snapping his fingers again, to disagree with Detective Dupin. I agree, Officer Luciana said, and gave Olaf a big lipstick smile as he stepped through the doorway. Now let's get down to business, Dupin. Do you have any important information? We have some important information, Claus said boldly. This man is not Detective Dupin. There were a few gasps from the crowd. He's Count Olaf. You mean Count Omar, Miss Morrow said. We mean Olaf, Violet said, and then turned so that she was looking Count Olaf right in his sunglasses. Those sunglasses may be hiding your eyebrow, and those shoes may be hiding your tattoo, but you can't hide your identity. You're Count Olaf, and you've kidnapped the Quagmire triplets and murdered Jacques. Jacques. Who in the world is Jacques? Asked an elder. I'm confused. It's not cool, Olaf said with a snap, to be confused, so let me see if I can help you. He pointed at himself with a flourish. I am the famous Detective Dupin. I am wearing these plastic shoes and sunglasses because they're cool. Count Olaf is the name of a man who was murdered last night, and these 3 children, here Olaf paused to make sure everyone was listening, are responsible for the crime. Don't be ridiculous, Olaf, Claus said disgustedly. Olaf smiled nastily at the 3 Baudelaires. You are making a mistake when you call me Count Olaf, he said, and if you continue to call me that, you will see exactly how big a mistake you are making. Detective Dupin turned and looked to address the crowd. Of course, the biggest mistake these children have made is thinking that they can get away with murder. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. I never trusted those kids, Miss Morrow said. They didn't do a very good job when they trimmed my hedges. Show them the evidence, Officer Luciana said, and Detective Dupin snapped his fingers. It's not cool, he said, to accuse people of murder without any evidence, but luckily I've found some. He reached into his pocket of his blazer and brought out a long pink ribbon decorated with plastic daisies. I found this right outside Count Olaf's jail cell, he said. It's a ribbon, the exact kind of ribbon that Violet Baudelaire uses to tie up her hair. The townspeople gasped, and Violet turned to see that the citizens of VFD were looking at her with suspicion and fear, which are not pleasant ways to be looked at. That's not my ribbon, Violet cried, taking her own hair ribbon out of her pocket. My ribbon is right here. How can we tell? Another asked with a frown. All hair ribbons look alike. They don't look alike, Claus said. The one found at the murder scene is fancy and pink. My sister prefers plain ribbons, and she hates the color pink. And inside the jail cell, Detective Dupin continued, as if Claus had not spoken. I found this. He held up a small circle of glass. This is one of the lenses in Claus's glasses. But my glasses aren't missing any lenses, Claus cried, as everyone looked at him in suspicion and fear. He took his glasses off and showed them to the crowd. You can see for yourself. Just because you have replaced your ribbon and lenses, Officer Luciana said, doesn't mean you're not murderers. Actually, they're not murderers, Detective Dupin said. They're accomplices. He leaned forward till he was right in the Baudelaire's faces, and the children could smell his sour breath as he continued talking. You orphans are not smart enough to know what the word accomplice means, but it means helper of murderers. We know what the word accomplice means, Claus said. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the 4 tooth marks on Count Olaf's body, Detective Dupin said, with a snap of his fingers. There's only one person uncool enough to bite people to death, and that's Sonny Baudelaire. That's true that her teeth are sharp, another member of the council said. I've noticed that when she served my hot fudge sundae. Our sister didn't bite anyone to death, Violet said indignantly, a word which here means in defense of an innocent baby. Detective Dupin is lying. It's not cool to accuse me of lying, Dupin replied. Instead of accusing other people of things, why don't you 3 children tell us where you were last night? We were at Hector's house, Claus said. He'll tell you himself. The middle Baudelaire stood up on tiptoe and called out over the crowd. Hector, tell everyone that we were with you. The citizens looked this way and that, and the crow hats of the elders bobbing as they listened for a word from Hector. But no word came. The 3 children waited for a moment in a tense silence, thinking that surely Hector would overcome his skittishness in order to save them. But the handyman was quiet. The only sounds the children could hear was the splashing of the foul fountain and the muttering of the roosting crows. Hector sometimes gets skittish in front of crowds, Violet explained. But it's true. I spent the night working in a studio, and Claus was reading in the secret library, and... Enough nonsense, Officer Luciana said. Do you really expect us to believe that our fine handyman is building mechanical devices and has a secret library? Next, I suppose, you'll say that he's building things out of feathers. It's bad enough that you killed Count Olaf, an elder said, but now you're trying to frame Hector for other crimes. I say that VFD no longer serve as guardian for such terrible orphans. Hear, hear, cried several voices scattered in the crowd, just as the children had planned to do themselves. I will send a message to Mr. Poe right away, the elder continued, and the banker will come and remove them in a few days. A few days is too long to wait, Miss Morrow said, and several citizens cheered in agreement. These children need to be taken care of as quickly as possible. I say that we burn them at the stake, cried Mr. Lesko, who stepped forward to wag his finger at the children. Rule number 201 clearly says no murdering. We didn't murder anyone, Violet cried. A ribbon, a lens, and some bite marks aren't enough evidence to accuse someone of murder. That's enough evidence for me, an elder cried. We already have the torches. Let's burn them right now. Hold on a moment, another elder said. We can't simply burn people at the stake whenever we want. The Baudelaires looked at one another, relieved that one citizen seemed immune to mob psychology. I have a very important appointment in 10 minutes, the elder continued, so it's too late to do it now. How about tonight after dinner? That's no good, said another member of the council. I'm having a dinner party then. How about tomorrow afternoon? Yes, someone said from the crowd, right after lunch. That's perfect time. Hear, hear, Mr. Lesko cried. Hear, hear, Mrs. Morrow cried. Glaggy, Sonny cried. Hector, help us, Violet cried. Please tell these people that we're not murderers. I told you before, Detective Dupin said, smiling beneath his sunglasses. Only Sonny is a murderer. You two are accomplices, and I will put you all in jail where you belong. Dupin grabbed Violet's and Claus's wrists with one scraggly hand and leaned down to scoop up Sonny with the other. See you tomorrow afternoon for the burning at the stake, he called out to the rest of the crowd, and dragged the struggling Baudelaires through the door of the uptown jail. The children stumbled into a dim, grim hallway, listening to the faint sounds of the mob cheering as the door slammed behind them. I'm putting you in a deluxe cell, Dupin said. It's the dirtiest one. He marched them down a dark hallway with many twists and turns, and the Baudelaires could see rows and rows of cells, with their heavy doors hanging open. The only light in the jail came from the tiny barred windows placed in each cell, but the children saw that every cell was empty and each one looked dirtier than the rest. You'll be the one in jail before long, Olaf, Claus said, hoping he sounded much more certain than he felt. You'll never get away with this. My name is Detective Dupin, he said, and my only concern is bringing you three criminals to justice. But if you burn us at the stake, Violet said quickly, you'll never get your hands on the Baudelaire fortune. Dupin rounded the last corner of the hallway and pushed the Baudelaires into a small damp cell with only a wooden bench as furniture. By the light of the barred window, the siblings could see that the cell was quite filthy, as Dupin had promised. The detective reached out to pull the door closed, but with his sunglasses on, it was too dark to see the door handle. So he had to throw off all pretense, a phrase which here means take off a part of his disguise for a moment and remove his sunglasses. As much as the children hated Dupin's ridiculous disguise, it was worse to see their enemy's one eyebrow and the shiny, shiny eyes that had been haunting them for so long. Don't worry, he said in his wheezy voice. You won't be burned at the stake. Not all of you, at least. Tomorrow afternoon, one of you will make a miraculous escape, if you consider being smuggled out of the VFD by one of my assistants to be an escape. The other two will be burned at the stake as planned. You bratty orphans are too stupid to realize it, but a genius like me knows that it may take a village to raise a child, but it only takes one child to inherit a fortune. The villain laughed a loud and rude laugh and began to shut the door of the cell. But I don't want to be cruel, he said, smiling to indicate that he really wanted to be as cruel as possible. I'll let you three decide who gets the honor of spending the rest of their puny life with me, and who gets to burn at the stake. I'll be back at lunchtime for your decision. The Baudelaire orphans listened to the wheezy giggle of their enemy as he slammed the cell door and walked back down the hallway in his plastic shoes, and felt a sinking feeling in their stomachs. Where the huevos rancheros Hector had made for them last night were still being digested. When something is being digested, of course, it is getting smaller and smaller as the body uses up all of the nutrients inside the food, but it didn't feel that way to the three children. The youngsters did not feel as if the small potatoes they had eaten for dinner were getting smaller. The Baudelaire orphans huddled together in the dim light and listened to the laughter of the echo against the walls of the uptown jail, and wondered just how large the potatoes of their lives would grow. Chapter time for next time.